you need to hopefully develop a sense of internal self-worth and get some external validation. That's always good. We do need that from people like our partners, people that we work with, people that we're close to. All of those things are really important, but it is all about finding that balance. And sometimes you do need things like therapy, like medication, which, Jase, you're on both of those paths that we've talked about, and hopefully that has been helping you with this specifically. For myself, I mean, getting out of a situation that wasn't good for me ended up being something that I think has put me on a path of not necessarily needing to people please so much, because I saw how that was really detrimental to my mental well-being and my health as well. And I think that approval seeking is one thing, but hopefully I personally have a little bit more of a balance now.
Welcome to the Multiamory podcast. I'm Jase.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Dedeker.
We believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, swinging, casually dating, or if you just do relationships differently, we see you, and we're here for you.
Things I know I did, forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're talking about the need for approval and how it could be hurting your relationships. We're going to get into some of the differences between approval seeking and people pleasing, which can be pretty similar to each other, as well as why this might not be all bad, but definitely can be a problem if it gets out of hand. With all of that, we're excited to get into this discussion. Also, if you're interested in learning more about our fundamental communication tools that we reference on this show, you can check out our book, Multiamory: Essential Tools for Modern Relationships. You can get information about that at multiamory.com/book, or get it wherever you buy books. To kick this off, let's start at the front door, or rather, we'll start at an entryway with two doors, one of which is labeled approval seeking, and the other is labeled people-pleasing.
Does one of them tell the truth and one of them always lies?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, wait.
No, I'm just kidding.
I want a third door option, which is that, you're not doing either of these things.
Just the
that
exit, the emergency exit.
There you go.
Right,
you're
right.
living in a secure way where you don't have to do either of these things. I always go through at least one of these doors, and it's not that one that I just referenced, sadly.
Right. So let's start by just talking a little bit about the difference between these, because there is some overlap. So maybe it's a little bit of like a quantum door where they're sort of overlapping each other a little bit, you know?
Cool.
Wow. So they're like the doors exist on like multiple planes of existence?
Yeah, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. I think it's that the doors exist in a superposition with each other.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
We're in a quantum realm, is what we're saying. Great.
So approval seeking is this term that's focused on the desire for validation and positive reinforcement from others. Like the name says, approval seeking. So it's about avoiding disapproval, seeking acceptance, and this can be something like constantly seeking compliments, or constantly doing something and then kind of checking like, oh, was that good? Was that good? It's like a little bit of this, maybe doing some things like avoiding conflict or changing opinions to match others, but kind of based on the reactions. It's like you want that approval. You want to know that you're accepted. Another way approval seeking could show up is something on social media, like really paying attention to how many comments or likes or that sort of thing that you get. On the other hand, people-pleasing, which we have talked about before on this show, is more tied to your specific actions that you take. So this can be things like going out of your way to please others, changing your opinion to match like what the other person has just stated, versus kind of doing it for approval. That's why they're so similar, right? There's a lot of overlap here. This could be saying yes to everything, like not being able to say no to stuff, taking on too much responsibility, not bringing up conflict because you don't want to have anyone be upset. You're just constantly apologizing. So we'll see there's some overlap here, but I tried to come up with an analogy to explain a little bit of the heart of the difference. So imagine that you're a performer on stage.
I can imagine that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can also imagine that.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Approval seeking is like them constantly looking to the audience for applause and cheers, wanting to make sure people are liking it. And then people pleasing is changing the way they act based on what they think the audience wants to see. Even if it means, compromising their artistic integrity or making a choice that doesn't seem right for the character, but it's like, oh, that's what I think the audience wants. They want funny here, so I'll do that instead. Versus like doing the thing and then looking. You can see how they're related, right? You can have a little feedback loop between
Yeah,
the two.
they're related, but it seems like approval seeking is more like something that could motivate you versus it seems like people pleasing. It sounds like there's maybe a little bit more self betrayal potentially in there, or just an obliteration of what you want or what your boundaries are, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And so now, of course, the question is, which door did you choose?
I have quantumly leapt through both at the same time. No, this is really interesting because as you were describing it, I was realizing that in my work life, I tend to do a lot of approval seeking. And in my relational life, I tend to do a lot of people pleasing. I feel like I am better at the people pleasing now that I'm out of my last relationship.
Like better at not
But-
doing it, you mean?
Yes, I do it less because it resulted in a lot of like diminishing of self in order to try to fit and mold myself into a box that was going to be comfortable enough for my partner. A lot of that is because maybe of conflict and family of origin stuff, et cetera, that you choose to kind of put yourself on that route. But in terms of approval seeking, I think especially at the beginning of jobs, I try to ask for a lot of approval or make sure that somebody really likes me, that I am on a track where I'm never going to be someone that they dislike, or I want people to know that they can rely on me, etc. And it has done really well in terms of the kinds of jobs that I have gotten and how I'm able to like escalate in them. So I don't know. I feel like that one in particular has actually been okay for me, whereas the people pleasing has done really bad things for my relational life. How about the two of you? Dedeker's like, I've never done this in my life. Either of them.
That's not true. No, that's not true. I think for me, my own approval seeking tendencies are a little bit more wrapped up in my own maybe perfectionistic tendencies. So there's
Yeah.
a certain amount of, okay, well, I'm going to do it perfectly because that's how I'm going to get approval, or I'm going to get an A+, and that's the main channel to approval, I suppose. But then I also think, I don't know, in my relationship with you, Jase, I think I do some approval seeking, but I can't tell, is that from me or is that more your influence? And now approval seeking has become a little bit of a love language
Oh, that's
in this
interesting.
relationship where,
Interesting.
we will go through some moments of being like, oh my God, do you like me? Do you think I'm cool?
That's a Jase thing, 100%.
You see, exactly.
And so I see now you have
Exactly.
taken on that trait. Got
Yes.
it.
Now I think I've
Got
taken
it,
that
got
on a
it.
little bit. Because is that something, I don't know if that's something that I've done as much in other relationships.
I don't recall you ever doing that before Jase started doing it to you. So now the two of you do it to one another. That's very interesting.
Right. And it's an interesting mix of, on the one hand, kind of asking for the reinforcement that you need. And then am I crossing a line into, now I'm relying on this too much, right? Like, am I putting too much of my own self-esteem or my own well-being outside of myself?
Yeah.
I feel like for me, the way that approval seeking has shown up is usually in times when I've felt bad about myself, wishing that I had more clear approval. It's not even like someone stated that they didn't like something, but I didn't quite get enough approval or didn't get the approval that I wanted. And so they must dislike me, or they must have hated what I did and they were just being polite, or like that kind of thinking is how this has shown up in my life the most, I think.
It's that external validation that you're asking somebody to give you in order for you to internally feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
that's what it is for me, for sure, especially when I start a new job and I'm like, do they like me? Are they
Right.
going to want to promote me and tell me that I'm doing the thing good? So,
Well, and that's an interesting thing. So in part 2 of this episode, the middle section of this episode is when we're going to get into some of the positive aspects of approval seeking. But to start out, let's look a little bit at the dark side. You could even think of it like an approval addiction or an over-reliance on external validation or too much approval seeking. So just to give a little bit of background, I'm not going to go in depth on any studies for this one, but there have been a number of studies that have looked at the link between approval seeking and self-esteem. So not surprisingly, lower self-esteem tends to be correlated with higher approval seeking. There have also been some links between approval seeking and anxiety levels, which again, I think is not surprising, at least based on my own experience, that, higher anxiety would lead to more feeling like you need that external validation to maybe stabilize you. And then specifically social anxiety and approval seeking have been correlated pretty strongly with each other. There was one study I wanted to point out, partly because the name just really captured me. And this is a 2016 study by Steers et al. And this is called, I Want You to Like Me, extroversion, need for approval, and time on Facebook as predictors of anxiety.
Woof.
You can tell it's a 2016 study because it's Facebook instead of,
Right.
TikTok or something else or Instagram. But this was a relatively small study of 280 college students. But what I thought was interesting was they had people fill out a questionnaire to get a sense of their overall well-being in terms of feelings of anxiety, how introverted or extroverted they were, and the amount of approval seeking that they did, right? So that was kind of baked into the questions. And then they looked at how much time each of these students spent on Facebook. And what they found was people who spent more time on Facebook had higher levels of anxiety. Just in general, there was that trend. But they found that the people who spent more time on Facebook, but who identified as extroverts, had less of a correlation. So their anxiety in that group didn't go up at the same rate as the social media use did versus the introverts, where the anxiety and the Facebook use both went up similarly. And then the other one was that people who had more approval-seeking behaviors also had higher anxiety the more time they spent on Facebook. Now, this is not a causation, but just a correlation between them. But I do think that's interesting. Like, we don't know is it the anxiety causing the more time on Facebook? Is it the introversion causing that? Or is it the other way around? That we can't really say. But I just thought it was interesting that it's like there are some factors that can mitigate this. And so maybe this could be a bigger concern for us introverts in terms of this social media-based approval-seeking anxiety.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that as well. Because again, I'm looking at what I would perceive as two introverts in front of me, and one is far more likely to seek approval versus the other one. And yet you both are fairly introverted.
Well, I think, okay, I have a theory, and it actually has nothing to do with Facebook, but I'm realizing just by looking at the title of that study that the sentiment of I want you to like me is, I would think, pretty universal, pretty human, pretty innate. And we'll get into that more in depth later in the episode that, yeah, most of us want to be liked by other people. So that's one truth. But then there's this other competing truth that it's impossible to be liked by absolutely everyone. There's a certain amount that is out of our control, right? As to whether or not someone likes us. And I think how we deal with that inherent tension is really interesting. That I think for some people, it pulls them in the direction, the I want you to like me direction, right? Like I feel like I need to overcompensate because it's hard to live with the discomfort that not everybody is going to like me. And I think for other people, it pulls them in the opposite direction, a little bit more of this, screw it anyway. I'm not going to seek
looking
liking.
at those two directions in front of me.
You see those two doors? These two doors nested within the approval-seeking
There are two
doors.
doors.
Right,
Yes.
right.
There are two wolves inside you.
Yes.
Yeah. I've been pondering this while you were talking about your question about the introverts versus extroverts and social media and approval seeking. And so I'm not an extrovert, and this is not what I researched specifically for this, because this episode wasn't about introversion and extroversion. I just thought that was an interesting tidbit. So if people want to jump into the Discord in the thread for discussing this episode, I'd actually love to hear other people's experiences, especially those of you who identify as extroverts. So that's in our Discord, which you can join by going to multiamory.com/join and joining our community there on a sliding scale. But to answer the question, my two guesses. One is I wonder if extroverts may, either because of being an extrovert or it goes the other way around, but may have less social anxiety, which we learned about in other studies is linked to approval seeking. Just like by nature of being an extrovert, it seems like social anxiety and extroversion are less likely to go together. Again, don't know, just guessing here. And the other one is I feel like as an extrovert, there's more of this sense of like, I'm connecting with new people a lot. I like connecting with new people versus an introvert where there could be this sense, like I know I've felt this sometimes, this sense of this group of people I've managed to become close with is hard to replenish. And so if any of these end up not liking me, that's a bigger problem than if I had a much wider, feeling of like, oh yeah, I make new friends all the time. I get close with people really easily, really quickly. Just throwing those out there. There's no science behind that at all, just my own speculation.
But I do think that that's an interesting distinction because for myself, when I meet a new person, I don't necessarily really care what they think of me. It's fun to get to know them, but you're building a potential relationship. Whereas if you know somebody well, or if they're in a position of power over you, for instance, then I feel like the approval seeking in me at least kicks into high gear.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm like, oh God, in order to maintain this relationship or further it, I'm going to have that approval seeking come into play. Whereas if I just meet them and I don't know, like it's going to be one evening of seeing them and hanging out with them, I don't really care that much what they think of me. If they don't like me right off the bat, whatever. I don't have to ever see you again, potentially. All right, let's move on to signs of approval addiction, which is interesting. I didn't even know this was a thing, but I suppose it probably is that one might be addicted or have addictive tendencies regarding seeking approval.
Yeah, I'd say this is addiction in the non-clinical sense, right?
Yes.
More of just maybe you've gone too far down the hallway that's past the door labeled approval seeking.
We're really
Boy,
like
we're
going
really
on this,
building
just like really leaning into the
labyrinth.
metaphor.
When do we get to David Bowie? That's all I care about.
Ooh,
Sure, we'll
definitely.
see.
Yes.
The ultimate prize.
One of the signs is that you might be overly sensitive to criticism. So that's not just disliking criticism in a way that, feels fairly normal to people. It's hard to receive criticism, but if you're left feeling really devastated by that and you take it as a personal attack, even if it's constructive, that might be a sign that you are seeking approval too much or that it has become something in your life that is detrimental to it. Another sign of approval addiction is constantly second-guessing yourself, so maybe doubting your own judgment, needing other people to validate your decision, even for small things in your life, little mundane tasks or small things that you're doing at work, for instance, like you constantly need approval on absolutely everything.
Another sign of approval addiction could be avoiding conflict at all costs. So as in when you disagree with someone or maybe you want something or you have a particular preference, but you stay silent about it because you fear their disapproval or confrontation. And again, I guess to differentiate it from people pleasing, that maybe people pleasing would be that you change what your preference is, to try to better match what the other person is saying versus maybe with leaning on the approval seeking side of it. Like maybe you don't go so far as to change your preference, but you go out of your way to not bring up your preference if you're worried that it's going to be disapproved of in some way, I would imagine. But of course, there's a lot of overlap. It's like this can be an on-ramp into full-blown people-pleasing behaviors that can become compulsive, right? So feeling strong urges to seek approval constantly, even when you know that it's not healthy, like compulsively checking social media responses, compulsively checking in all the time. I had an ex who I think had a little bit of this tendency of like all the time wanting to check, like, did I do it right? Did I do this thing right? Did I handle this situation correctly? Stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good example there of that kind of needing you to approve of everything that I do. Yeah, that's a good one.
Or I think also I know what I noticed in this person was often like a projecting of my disapproval. So as
that's
in,
really interesting.
yeah,
Like an
assuming that I was going to
assumption of
assumption of
yeah.
disapproval, and therefore always feeling like they kind of had like this mountain to, I guess, to traverse first.
That's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy there, that you
Yeah,
are,
a little
if you
bit.
continue instilling that in another person's mind, they may start to believe, yeah, perhaps I should be
Should
checking
disapprove of
in on
this
yeah,
or something. Like,
checking in on this person and what
Yeah.
they're doing before I really can absolutely say with certainty that, they're making the right decision in something.
yeah. Sometimes I get a little bit of that from you, Jase. Like a little bit of assuming that I might disapprove of something that you do or like or want or something like that. When
Yeah,
that's maybe
I
not
was
the
going to
case.
say, I think this is interesting because she's not talking about me in this example here. And yet, yeah, I do think that I have some of that. And that's all stuff that I have been working on, but it's a work in progress, right? But yeah, that kind of sense of, kind of like I mentioned earlier, of that assumption of like, if you didn't get negative feedback, but maybe it wasn't the right positive feedback or enough of it, that there's this assumption of, oh, well, it must be negative then. Like it must be that these people disapproved of me, that was something that I wrestled with a lot and that has been getting better. So yeah, I think it's like I can relate to it, but I think with all of this, it's a matter of degrees, right? We might all do this to a certain extent, and I think I do this one a little, but not as much as that other partner that Dedeker was mentioning. And so I think with these different behaviors, it's also worth looking at it all holistically and seeing, how is this actually affecting my life and affecting my relationships? So in that, just some examples of how this can negatively affect your relationships and your well-being. The first one that comes to mind is codependency, which is basically what Dedeker was just getting at right there, is kind of this unhealthy, one-sided reliance on the other person validating you in order to get your self-worth or your self-confidence or your self-esteem. Another one can be difficulty setting boundaries. This one overlaps a lot with people-pleasing as well, but it's kind of that like, well, I don't want to do anything too challenging to you because I need your approval. So I'm just going to kind of go with what I think that you want, which is a little more people-pleasing, but I think these overlap a little there. And this one's maybe unclear about the causation versus correlation, but low self-esteem that I've seen myself get into a loop where it feels like by seeking that external validation and seeking that approval can kind of lead to a lower baseline of my own self-esteem. And which caused which is hard to say, but definitely I think that's something that we can see happening there.
This is reminding me a lot of our episode on the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. It's the fawn, correct? It's this trauma response where we have to sort of make sure that everyone's okay around us. And I think that is sort of the more insidious part of the people pleasing that we get into. And it's interesting that you're talking about the fact that one sort of goes into the other over time, potentially, that maybe if you are approval seeking all the time, that can become people pleasing, and that can become this just fawn response where you're second guessing everything. And also for yourself, for your well-being, there's an increased risk of burnout. If you are constantly putting others' needs first, it can lead to emotional exhaustion and physical health problems even.
This brings back memories of being in a relationship when I was much younger where I think I really, really wanted this person's approval. And I was just remembering, yeah, like you said, that emotional exhaustion of like I have to constantly track this person's reactions to what I do. And I have to constantly create, again, those mental gymnastics of like how I present something of like to this person about what I want or what I'm deciding to do or things like that. Yeah, I think even if you're someone who maybe has some pretty good boundaries around your time, for instance, or your limits, that, yeah, I think there is a little bit of this amorphous burden of always having that little voice in the back of your head wanting to check in on whether or not somebody approves of you. In my case, it was like a specific person, but I imagine that for somebody, it could be either a specific person or it could be, I don't know,
Everyone.
the world at large or your community or a particular community.
That just made me think of something else. I'm curious what the two of you think in terms of where this falls on the people-pleasing, approval-seeking spectrum. But it's about if you have something difficult to talk to a friend or a partner about, and I think we've all encountered some version of someone doing this to us or us doing this to someone where you kind of start saying the thing you need to say. Maybe it's that you want to break up or you want to de-escalate or you want to stop doing something or start doing something. That there's this sense of, I'm starting to tell you, and then based on how you're reacting to it, I may just stop and not tell you all of the truth of what I actually wanted to come here to say. Like maybe I'll overly soften it. Maybe I'll leave some open ends that I actually didn't really want to leave. It's more like, no, I'm done with this. Not, well, we'll see, we'll take a break. Right? It's that kind of last minute pivot that involves not being quite totally honest in our communication. And I'm wondering if that actually might have more to do with approval seeking than people pleasing, because it's kind of about like I'm evaluating the reactions I'm getting back, and then I'm kind of pivoting or stopping where I think I'll still get some approval.
Well, what it makes me think of, is, specifically to use a breakup example, I think about how what I see, and I've seen this both in myself and other people and people that I've worked with and clients, that sometimes during a breakup specifically, people can really bend over backwards to try to make sure that they're not seen as the bad guy by the other person.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You know, and I feel like that's sort of maybe a weird backwards version of approval seeking, right? I want to leave this relationship for my own reasons, and I recognize that those reasons may be hurtful to you, but I still want you to approve of me as a person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, again, I think we can put ourselves in this bind of like just not knowing how to deal with the discomfort that our actions, even if it's the right action, may hurt somebody's feelings. And so therefore, I do see people sometimes get caught in these ongoing cycles with a partner they're trying to break up with or an ex, because they're still trying to salvage the sense of like, yeah, but you still approve of me at the end of the day, even though I broke your heart.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might say that the people pleasing is the one that maybe keeps you in a relationship longer because you don't want to have conflict. And then the approval seeking is where you kind of chicken out partway through or kind of overly soften or something to
Are you
avoid
just like
disapproval.
talking to me right now?
It's a very
I'm talking to my
passive-aggressive episode.
Yeah,
I'm
I've
talking
done
to my
both of
past
these.
self and you and
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah, no, I've definitely done this, and I've definitely encountered this in other people. But I think if you're someone who tends to be attentive to how other people feel, you might be extra susceptible to this. I think that's
Something to
definitely
think
been
about.
the case for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing is that you might have difficulty experiencing genuine intimacy with another person, because true intimacy does really require vulnerability and authenticity, and that can be really challenging for somebody who is a constant approval seeker and who fears judgment of another person. Again, if you're just constantly looking for that approval, asking for that approval, trying to do things in order to get that approval from someone, you are potentially setting yourself up for never really being vulnerable, and maybe even causing somebody to have a moment of dislike or a moment of, ooh, that was hard to take or that was hard to hear. But I think that like true intimacy is being able to offer yourself up fully to someone, even if it's not always going to look pretty or
Yeah.
perfect.
So before we go on to talking about how approval seeking is good, just sort of throw everything we just said right in the garbage and try to approach this from the other direction. But before we do that, I just wanted to say we've been really excited about the last few months of making a lot of improvements and changes in our Discord community specifically. And so one of those I mentioned earlier in the episode is that we have different threaded conversations in our episode discussion channel. So even if you're behind on episodes, you could go in there and either start a new thread if it's an older episode, or on any of the current ones, you can join in the discussion on that particular episode. And so it kind of allows you to have those sorts of conversations with other people, even if you're separated in time. It's like that one movie. What was that? The Lake House? Was that the one?
Oh,
Is that
yeah.
the Sandra Bullock movie?
And Keanu
Keanu
Reeves?
Reeves? Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
what
that's
a
the one.
random.
Yeah, where they're like writing letters to each other, but they're in different times, at different
Yeah.
points in time. That kind of spoiler alert. Sorry.
Yeah, I watched a Hallmark movie like that once.
Right, right.
No, it was a Hallmark movie, Dedeker. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, really?
no.
Oh, okay. I wouldn't be
It
surprised.
wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah, might as well have
Yeah,
been.
yeah.
I did actually watch a Hallmark movie. That wasn't just a joke.
Got it.
I love it. I love it. But anyway, if you want to be your own lake house and join our community, you can go to multiamory.com/join, where you can join one of our support tiers there. They're all on a sliding scale now so that you can get access to all of the rewards at whatever level you're able to contribute to help keep this show going. In the meantime, check out our sponsors for this show. If any are interesting to you, please use our promo codes or the links in our episode description, because that does help directly support our show. And we're back. On this episode, we're discussing how approval seeking is great. Just kidding. But we are going to look a little bit at why it's not all bad, right? And so I have a thought experiment for you at home and you two sitting here with me.
Okay.
Imagine a world in which there's a total lack of approval seeking. So no matter what you do,
I don't think I can. But
yeah,
okay,
you're not
I'll
paying
try.
any attention to how other people are reacting to it, right? You don't, it doesn't matter to you at all. And I think sometimes when we're worried about our self-esteem, we'll say things like that of like, oh, I wish I just didn't care what other people thought. But
Yeah.
if you imagine, if you will, the reality of that world where you actually don't care and nobody cares, I feel like any kind of relationship would be impossible.
Sure.
Because I think that requires a certain amount of attentiveness to the other person and kind of how they're feeling and what their needs are and what makes me gel in this particular social group or what feels good for both of us in this relationship. And so as social animals, approval seeking is actually super important. I would even put it in like a vital skill for survival as a human. Right? For us, kind of as a species, as a whole, right? That we needed to have a certain amount of approval seeking, or at least like approval awareness, I guess you could say, in order for us to team up and be all that we can be.
And look how far we've come, Jase.
Yes. Far we've come, indeed.
Yeah, I think that's the issue at hand is the potential lack of awareness for other people, that by seeking approval in somebody else, we have an awareness of what it is that they like and what it is that they want. And if we just completely got rid of that, it might be really difficult for us, like in social constructs, in social moments, to be able to say, yeah, I can tell that this person is done with this conversation right now. I'm going to let them be, for instance, or I can tell that my partner is going through something, even though they're not necessarily telling me immediately. And so I want them to feel okay. And so I'm going to ask them, or I'm going to check out, is this thing that I did fine with you? Is it okay? Because I want to make sure that I'm not hurting them, for instance.
Yeah, it's like a certain amount of being aware and checking in. It's also making me think about basically the trend we've seen in the last several decades in both pet, like dog training, and also child rearing, which is this moving away from, I'm going to focus on punishing you for your bad behaviors by spanking you or yelling at you or something like that, and into more rewarding for good behaviors. But if there were no approval seeking, the babies wouldn't care, the dogs wouldn't care, right? Like clearly it's like we'd rather focus on the approval seeking than just having to rely on punishment to get our message across. So I think there's a clear example of why we don't want to actually get rid of this completely.
Yeah, there's plenty of benefits to moderate approval seeking. And actually, I liked you framing it as approval awareness. Because, yeah, it does help us to foster connection, to create more of a sense of empathy, because it encourages us to maybe share a little bit more openly. Sometimes, ironically, I know we've shared all these stories about how approval seeking can like shut us down or prevent us from sharing openly. But I also do think that sometimes it can motivate us to take these little risks, right? Of, hey, I need to tell you that like this is something that I want, or this is something that I like, or this is something about me. Do you approve of that? Is that okay? Right? And taking those little risks, I would argue, are the building blocks of close, intimate relationships. It can encourage positive behavior, so it can motivate self-improvement, you know, so it can motivate, like, I want this person to see me in a positive light, and so I'm going to show up for them. I'm going to apologize for my past bad behavior, or I'm going to try to do something so that I can hold them in a better way, in a more reliable way in this relationship. It can help enhance our communication, again, prompting us to have more honest dialogue. It helps us to build trust and security, especially if someone's able to offer you that reassurance of like, yes, I do approve of you, right? Like, even though you shared this vulnerable thing, or maybe this thing that doesn't paint you in the best light, that I do still love you, care for you, want you in my life. It can promote a sense of mutual respect, in the sense that like you're conveying to someone that like, hey, you are important, and like your feelings about me and my actions are important, right? And so I am bringing you into the fold, and that's just a marker of consideration. Or it can facilitate personal growth, right? Like it can encourage that sense of self-reflection around, how do I show up in my relationships? Like, what are the things that people do approve or not approve as far as I'm concerned? Are there areas of where other people disapprove of that I can learn to live with or that I should change, for instance?
One thing just to be aware of with all of this is that there are cultural differences here too. So for example, something we like to mention is that in our North American and Western culture, there's a lot of emphasis put on individualism versus places like Japan, where there's more of a collectivistic culture. And so I would say that in those, whatever this sort of sweet spot of approval seeking is might vary a little bit, or it might just look different in terms of the types of behaviors that show up more than others. Something that I find is that we'll often idolize kind of antisocial people in our media, which can be a bit of a problem. But I think that might be something that we find fascinating because it's so different from actually how most of us live our lives. I don't know. There's something there. And then, of course, social media being this new factor, right? That as humans, approval seeking and being aware of other people's opinions has been important for us evolutionarily. And yet, never before have we had access to what all of these people think about us, or at least what we perceive they think about us by how many likes they gave our post, right? Or how many comments it got or something like that, that we have a lot more input that can be used negatively in this. So just a couple things to throw out there to be aware of with all of this. I guess some little caveats there.
Yeah, moderate approval seeking is good, but we want some balance here with that. And it is important to be aware of the risks of excessive or chronic approval seeking. You need to hopefully develop a sense of internal self-worth and get some external validation. That's always good. We do need that from people like our partners, people that we work with, people that we're close to. All of those things are really important, but it is all about finding that balance. And sometimes you do need things like therapy, like medication, which, Jase, you're on both of those paths that we've talked about, and hopefully that has been helping you with this specifically. For myself, I mean, getting out of a situation that wasn't good for me ended up being something that I think has put me on a path of not necessarily needing to people please so much, because I saw how that was really detrimental to my mental well-being and my health as well. And I think that approval seeking is one thing, but hopefully I personally have a little bit more of a balance now.
Yeah. So from here, we want to get into what does that look like? How do you put this into practice? How can we get back that balance that we were missing before, or that we've identified? I think I might be a little too far on one side of this or the other. But before we get to that, we're going to take another quick break to talk about our sponsors on this show. Again, give them a listen, use our promo codes or our links. That does really help our show. Or if you would rather support us directly, you can go to multiamory.com/join and join for a monthly subscription of whatever you're able to pay and get access to things like our Discord community, our ad-free episodes released a day early, our video discussion groups, things like that.
Now we're going to get into some actionable steps and tools for you if you feel like, wow, I am just looking for approval all over the place and maybe even have some of those addictive tendencies, and I want to move away from that. In the research, the common themes related to increased approval seeking were time spent on social media, your own personal self-esteem, if you have a lot of it or not. Probably if you are seeking approval, then that self-esteem is going to be lower. And then also anxiety, how anxious you are in general. So let's see if we can come up with maybe some fun ways to explore these areas and hopefully make improvements.
Yeah, so for this section, I wanted to shake it up a little bit, because there's kind of the normal advice that you'll get and that is good, right? Of contemplating these things, thinking about where it's coming from, maybe learning about your attachment style or learning better communication. And all of that's great. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to see if there were kind of some fun, shorter term things that you could try to get a sense of what might work for you, where there might be a pathway to making progress. So for this, we have 3 separate, you could think of them like games or maybe challenges. Challenges are hot. I think. So maybe we'll call them
What do you
challenges.
mean challenges are hot?
Like on social media, right? There's the whatever challenge,
Oh, yeah.
never
I don't
heard
know
of
if the
that,
kids
but
do
cool.
challenges anymore.
Is that not a thing?
I think
Okay.
that was
cycle just
the
moves
ice
too
bucket
quickly
challenge
now.
was a millennial thing for
yeah,
sure.
I think challenges are more millennial.
They're
No,
not
it's only dances, Jace.
the dance.
Make this
dance
into
Only
a
challenge.
dance,
Okay, shit. I should have made this into
but don't
a
put it on
dance.
social media and ask for approval. That's your
man.
challenge.
Yeah, I did one TikTok dance ever, and it was
Yeah.
just a couple weeks ago on my sister's TikTok.
And how do you
But-
feel?
I wish it had more likes, That was hard.
Yikes.
However, I did get a lot of approval from my sister and some of her friends for how fast I learned to dance.
Okay,
so
that's
I guess
good.
that felt good.
That's good. All right, here's a little challenge for you. And this is a good one for me. It is a no apology day. So see if you can go an entire day without apologizing to someone for, I don't know, like, oh, I'm so sorry that I took this plate away from you out of your hands and put it in the proper place where plates are supposed to go. I don't know.
Wait, what is the situation you're describing?
Yeah,
I think,
I'm also curious
Is this a
about
restaurant?
That was kind of a
industry?
restaurant thing,
Okay.
but I realized, it probably wasn't a great example. So I'm sorry about that. I'm
No,
sorry.
no
See?
apologies.
Exactly.
okay. This is a
Something
good
along
challenge
those-
for you. Yeah.
No, for sure.
Okay, so it's about unnecessary apologies specifically.
I say I'm
However you might
sorry.
interpret that.
Yes, I say I'm sorry all the time for
Yes,
really
you
silly
do.
things. And so this is a great one for me to just try to go an entire day without saying I'm sorry.
Well, report back to us when that happens.
I will try that. This is another good one for me is taking a social media vacation. So completely disconnect from all social media for at least one day or maybe a whole weekend. I do see people doing this fairly often or saying I'm going to log off of Facebook for a month, for instance. But the all social media, that's a big one because I really like Twitter or X, whatever it's called now. It's fun to scroll on Twitter. And if you just go a whole day without scrolling or Instagram or any of the above, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, well, I think here's the part that I think is interesting about it is to get a sense of how you feel at the beginning, in the middle, and the end of that experience.
Yeah.
Right. So this means not just not scrolling, but this is like turning off notifications so you're not getting messages, you're not getting anything. Right. So that's the part where you maybe need to tell anyone who relies on reaching you through Facebook Messenger or through Instagram DMs or something that you're not going to be available for a day. But I think it'll be interesting to see how you feel, right? Because I think, Emily, in your example, you might go through a little bit of this, well, what do I do now
Panic.
when I'm sitting here not
Sure.
scrolling through X, right? Or you may find yourself being kind of like antsy or wondering or worrying, oh, but people won't know what's going on with me. They'll be worried about me or something like that. And then kind of see how that changes throughout that day or that weekend. How do you feel in the middle of it? And then how do you feel by the end when you're thinking about going back to it? Has that changed your relationship at all? I find that a lot of people are surprised by how much everyone didn't notice.
Yeah. Because everyone's doing the same thing and they're
Because
worrying
there's
about
so much
themselves.
going on. Yeah,
no, exactly.
exactly.
Well, yeah, the three of us, I guess it was probably 4 or 5 years ago at this point, but we did a really amazing meditation retreat together where we had our phones taken away from us in the first
We didn't
day.
have our phones taken away from us.
We didn't.
No, we put our phones
them.
away somewhere. They don't take it. They don't forcibly take it from you.
Not forcibly, but I was like, please take this out of my hand so that I cannot look
I think
at
you
it.
had the option to give it to them.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I took that option because it would have been really difficult for me to not look. And, initially, yes, you go through a little bit of panic, but by the end, I didn't want them to give it back to me. I was like, you can keep it. You can keep it. So going through something like this, I think it puts into perspective how much you do tend to look at your phone. And I'm saying this to myself, even though I know all of us are addicted. So
Yeah. So that's a good challenge. I love that one. And then the third one here, this is the appreciate yourself challenge. And now this one could look a few different ways. And essentially it's like the idea of affirmations, right? So either out loud or in a journal, writing down or saying some kind of affirmation that you appreciate yourself for who you are and not just what you do. right? Because we're human beings, not human doings. And this is one that actually just last week in talking to my therapist, this was her thing, was like, I think you should try, saying this. And that one was just, I appreciate myself. It was super simple. We kind of toyed around with different wordings and I kept trying to change it to be like, well, what if it's like, I appreciate myself for working really hard, or I appreciate myself for whatever. And she was like, see, you're falling back to things you do that make you worthy of being appreciated, not just being, not just who you are. I'm still struggling with it. This is still my homework right now, so I'm working on this myself. But this could be something like, I appreciate myself. I am a kind and caring person. I am a good friend. And not something like, I take good care of my family, or I appreciate myself for how hard I work, or I appreciate that I'm a perfectionist, or I don't know, whatever it is, to focus on more of a state of being. And I think this one, for me, unlike the social media challenge that I think takes a little bit to start feeling weird, this one, like the second she said it to me, I was like, I don't know about that. And she's like, I can tell this makes you uncomfortable. I was like, yep.
It's probably why you should do it.
And I think also generally, if you think that this is something that you tend to slide into, just check in on how well you're taking care of yourself. I constantly think of this image that I saw that floats around the Instagram therapist space sometimes, but it was illustrated specifically in raccoons for some reason. I don't know why, but it made it stick in my brain. But basically it said, if you hate yourself, go take a shower. If you hate everyone else, go get something to eat. And if you feel like everyone hates you, go get some sleep. And because these things really do influence how we perceive the world and our relationships with other people. And the thing that I would add to that is, for maybe some of those, any of those, getting in some movement also, again, can just help to shake things up. And I think all of these things, if you're taking care of yourself, it can help you feel a little bit more grounded and have more resources to be able to handle a world that sometimes doesn't always give you approval all the time.
Yeah, these both came up. I just recently had a doctor visit with a new doctor who's great, but we were talking about, depression and anxiety and things like that. And the two things he talked about right away was sleep, asking how I'm sleeping, if I'm getting enough, and then if I'm exercising. And he was saying that just based on the research in terms of depression and anxiety, that it's specifically strength training exercise and getting enough sleep are the things that have this really, really strong causative effect, actually. Like you can actually study the causation and not just a correlation in those. So kind of showing like those are the big ones. So he's like, okay, as long as you're doing those, let's talk about how else we can treat this. But he's like, that's always where I have people start, is make sure you've got those two things going, or at least improving, that you're working on those.
And then also, of course, professional help. If this feels like this is a little too big, or there's something that's really sticky or overwhelming about this, that, CBT-based therapies can work to help reframe any kind of negative thought patterns that you have about yourself. Somatic therapies can help you to work through traumas, embodied fears that aren't maybe so easy to just reframe in your brain and talk through. I think especially with this, trying out affirmations, I think affirmations feel a little bit more CBT to me. And so for some people, that works really well to give sort of a replacement thought to focus on. And for other people, if your sense of not feeling like you have enough approval feels like it lives somewhere from the neck down and is really hard to get that emotional sense, there could, exploring it somatically could be really helpful too. Or things like antidepressants or anxiety medications, it could be a game changer for you if other things haven't done the trick.
And with all of this, just remember that it's a gradual process. So change takes time and consistent effort, but celebrate the small victories in reducing your approval seeking. So if you want to try one of those challenges, celebrate the fact that you did that at all, even if you started with just a few hours of not apologizing or not being on social media or appreciating yourself. Even if you try it just a little bit, celebrate that, enjoy that. I know that something Dedeker has been trying to bring into our lives more is this sense of feeling relief. Like if you get through something that's difficult or something you were worried about doesn't happen, of like taking a moment to just appreciate that feeling of relief, because so often we just blow past that into whatever the next thing is. And so I think with these challenges or with any of this stuff, if you do notice, like, hey, actually, I did get better sleep last night, and I'm noticing I don't feel as much of this anxiety or worry that people might not like me. Hey, cool. Let me take a moment, just a moment, to enjoy that for a second, right? That sometimes we forget to focus on when we're not suffering. And so just having that moment of like, hey, cool, this is nice, this is good, can be really valuable. So start today, just pick one small step. Could be one of those games, could be therapy, could be affirmations, any of that. And just do that and appreciate yourself for it. And I appreciate you for it too.
We
Not
all
that you need
appreciate
it
you.
from me. Not that you need it from us, but we do also appreciate you for it. All right. We would love to hear from all of you out there on our question of the week, which we post to our Instagram stories, which is, how does approval seeking show up in your social media habits? It's a good question for us to ask on social media because we know you're there if you're answering the question. So how does approval seeking show up in your social media habits? What does that look like for you? The best place to discuss this further is in our episode discussion channel on our Discord server in the thread for this episode. You can get access to that group and join our amazing community by going to multiamory.com/join. In addition, you can share publicly on Instagram at multiamory_podcast. Multiamory is created and produced by Dedeker, Winston, Emily Matlack, and me, Jase Lindgren. Our production assistants are Rachel Shennework and Carson Collins. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.